A heated clash erupts on a busy train when a young man insists an elderly man give up his seat. What happens next isn't just a lesson in respect. It's a moment that changes how he sees the world forever. It was a chilly morning in downtown Chicago, and the city was buzzing with its usual energy. The streets were alive with honking horns, chatter, and the rhythmic sound of footsteps on the pavement. Inside a crowded subway train, people were packed shoulder to shoulder, clutching their bags, phones, and morning coffees. Among them was Ethan, a young man in his early 20s. He had earbuds in, music blasting, and a look of mild irritation on his face as he leaned against the metal pole near the train's doors. Ethan wasn't a fan of public transportation. He usually drove his car, but today his car was in the shop, and he was stuck riding the train like everyone else. He wore a hoodie, ripped jeans, and sneakers, his posture slouched, exuding an air of impatience. He glanced around the crowded train, his eyes landing on an elderly man sitting a few feet away. The man, dressed in a worn but neatly pressed suit, had a kind face lined with years of experience. He clutched a cane in one hand and a small leather bag in the other. Ethan's annoyance grew as he noticed the man sitting while he had to stand. In his mind, it didn't seem fair. Why should he, young and tired from a late night of gaming, have to endure the discomfort of standing while this stranger got to sit? He felt a surge of frustration and decided to act on it. "Hey, old man," Ethan said loudly, pulling out one earbud. The train's hum seemed to quiet slightly as a few passengers turned their heads. "How about giving up your seat? You've been sitting long enough." The elderly man looked up, startled by the sudden demand. His gray eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, in a calm and measured tone, he replied, "Son, I need this seat. My legs aren't what they used to be." Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, I've got stuff to do too. I'm tired. You're just sitting there. Doesn't seem like you're doing much of anything." A murmur rippled through the train as a few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked at Ethan with disapproval, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The elderly man's expression didn't change. He simply adjusted his grip on his cane and said, "You don't know what someone's going through, young man. Perhaps you should think about that." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Yeah, whatever. You're just making excuses. I'm younger, so I should get the seat. Simple as that." Before the man could respond, a middle-aged woman standing nearby decided to step in. She had a no-nonsense demeanor and a voice that carried authority. "Young man, you ought to be ashamed of yourself," she said firmly. "That man is clearly older and needs the seat more than you do. Show some respect." Ethan's face turned red, not with shame but with defiance. "Respect? Respect is earned, lady. He hasn't done anything to earn mine." The elderly man raised a hand to calm the woman, who looked ready to argue further. "It's all right," he said softly. Then, turning back to Ethan, he added, "If you want the seat so badly, you can have it." Ethan smirked, feeling victorious. "Finally," he muttered, moving to take the seat. But just as he was about to sit down, the train lurched slightly, and the elderly man winced, gripping his cane tighter to steady himself. Ethan hesitated for a split second, noticing the man's discomfort, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He sat anyway, leaning back and putting his earbuds in, trying to ignore the disapproving stares from the other passengers. The train continued its journey, the atmosphere tense and quiet. Ethan could feel the weight of the silence around him, but he kept his eyes fixed on his phone, pretending not to care. However, something about the elderly man's calm demeanor and the way he'd handled the situation gnawed at him. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Ethan felt a twinge of guilt creeping in. The train pulled into the next station, and the elderly man stood slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. As he moved toward the doors, Ethan watched him out of the corner of his eye. A small part of him wanted to say something, to apologize or offer the seat back, but his pride held him back. The man exited the train without a word, disappearing into the crowd on the platform. Ethan leaned back in the seat, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. But as the train doors closed and it began to move again, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a mistake that might teach him a lesson he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Ethan found himself on the same train, standing in almost the exact spot as before. This time, he noticed the elderly man again, sitting in the same seat with his cane resting beside him. Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected to see him again, and now he felt the weight of yesterday's actions even more. The train was less crowded today, and there were a few empty seats scattered around. Ethan could have easily sat elsewhere, but instead he stayed standing, his thoughts racing. He kept glancing at the man, who seemed oblivious to his presence, focused on a small notebook he was writing in. Finally, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. As the train slowed for the next stop, he moved closer to the man and cleared his throat. The elderly man looked up, his expression neutral but curious. "Hey," Ethan began awkwardly, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. "About yesterday. I shouldn't have acted like that. It was rude and I'm sorry." The man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Ethan felt a wave of relief but also a need to explain himself. "I guess I was just having a bad day, but that's no excuse. I didn't think about how hard it might be for you to stand, and I was just being selfish." The elderly man's lips curved into a faint smile. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. That's a good first step." Ethan nodded, feeling a bit lighter. He glanced at the cane and then back at the man. "Is your leg okay? I mean, is it an old injury or something?" The man's expression softened. "Yes, an old injury from my time in the service. I've learned to manage, but standing for long periods can be tough." Ethan's eyes widened. "You were in the military?" The man nodded. "A long time ago. But that's not what matters here. What matters is how we treat each other, no matter the circumstances. Respect isn't about who's earned it. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He nodded again, this time with genuine understanding. "You're right. I'll remember that." The train came to a stop, and the man stood, steadying himself with his cane. Ethan instinctively reached out to help, but the man waved him off with a kind smile. "Thank you, son. Just keep learning. That's all anyone can ask." As the man exited the train, Ethan watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. The lesson wasn't just about giving up a seat. It was about seeing beyond himself, understanding that everyone has their struggles, and choosing kindness over judgment. From that day forward, Ethan made a conscious effort to be more aware of those around him. He offered his seat to others without hesitation, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And every time he did, he thought of the elderly man with the cane and the powerful lesson he'd taught without ever raising his voice.